welcome to Behind the Stack, a limited series podcast between myself and the guys at Fulfil ERP. It's going to be a podcast with a bit of a twist. Instead of focusing on all the nice fluffy stuff and all the front end things, we're going to go behind the scenes and then go a little bit deeper than most seem to be prepared to go. So if you're someone that's interested in learning more about what goes on behind the scenes and is relatable to you because you're working in an operational role, or you're working for a vendor and you want to understand more about this space and what some of the leading people in those roles are working on, this is going to be a great podcast for you. Welcome, Will, Andrew. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
So excited to have you here. And the first time we met, I think it was a chaotic mess that you had just turned around, and we were all just really, really shocked to see how much of an organizational improvement you had brought in a short period of time. So I think that's where we want to start. Most warehouses, most operations that we see, they're not well-disciplined organizations. How do you bring that in when you uh, go into and walk into a warehouse and lead the team?
Yeah, no, and I think, for context, definitely an unorganized mess is a good way to describe it. Really good people, typically when from my experience, when you walk into challenging situations, the people are never the problem. And it usually has to do with your systems, your processes, and really like a lack of discipline. And a lot of that just comes from leadership. So for me, it starts up front. That very simple. You grab a trash can and you start walking around your warehouse and you go clean it. A clean warehouse is a disciplined warehouse. Your people won't follow or do anything you won't do yourself. So when I got to Grunt Style, that was the first thing I did, is I grabbed a trash can and I spent about 4.5 hours walking through the aisles, picking up trash, going into the racks, finding out. And then during that time, I'm talking to associates, getting to know them, getting to understand some of their problems, some of their barriers. And then I'm hearing the horror stories of peak. And I'm hearing of, hey, we had 30,000 orders that we had inventory for, but we couldn't figure it out. That we had whiteboards that we were trying to use of like, oh yeah, I think it's in this location and pick it from there. And, complete no understand. I don't think people knew how to log into the WMS, let alone use it. And so just listening to them and talking to them. But for me, it starts there, right, with cleanliness, and you take your leaders with you when you do it, because then you're teaching, and that really is the hardest part. Is that people typically in an environment where there's no mistakes allowed, they tend to just do whatever doesn't get them yelled at, and that's never a good way to unlock human potential. And if you do that as a leader unintentionally, people usually do this unintentionally, don't mean to do it this way. But unintentionally, what you do is you stop all form of proactivity or just leveraging human talent. And that to me is just from my experience, especially working in the military. I was deployed for multiple years, over 4 years deployed, and other humans kept me alive. And I'm very grateful for those people. And so a very good understanding of that. There's a lot of talented people out there that know how to do really good things. They just need to be pointed in the right direction. And so you have to start by teaching them that you care about who they are as humans first, that you're going to change things, and that you have a plan. And typically that's what I do. I start with 5S. So I didn't invent that. I just follow it. And 5S is really actually hard, so you get to the first two: sort and set in order. So you need to remove all unnecessary equipment from the workspace. And that is why I take a trash can wherever, I go and start throwing away things. But the first thing you're going to notice is barriers, which is why your warehouse is usually so dirty, because there was like 4 trash cans in a 150,000 square foot building. Well, no wonder nobody has anything to throw away. So then what I would do is I'd be like, hey guys, watch this. Just take out your cell phone, time yourself, how long it takes. I tell this to my leaders. I go throw this trash away for me. I go, no, just go. Just time yourself. They come back. It took me 2.5 minutes. Well, yeah. You think anybody's going to stop picking for 2.5 minutes and go find something to throw away? I think we might have figured out a barrier, guys. Like, what if we put it right next to where they were going to turn a corner, right? They might just naturally throw it away. Don't you think you would do that? I would do that. So just starting from that perspective and really just keeping it basic. And then you have to learn how to connect your system to your processes.
Mm.
because that was, for example, at Grunt Style, we had a great platform. We had Fulfil, which is a very, very good WMS system matching to your ERP. Well, for some reason, they're like, oh, it doesn't work. I'm like, well, yeah, it doesn't work because you don't have inventory in the right locations and you're not managing the inventory. So, of course, the system thinks it needs to pick from that location. It's not in that location. That's why you can't close the order. So and then starting to, teach, right? And so you have to set routines. And then for me, I try to break them down into 1 hour blocks. Inside that hour, what are the key things I have to do? And you tie that to standard work. That standard work then becomes routine. You tie that standard work to resources in terms of the layout of your stations, layout of your picking areas, layout of your zoning. And then you start to tie all that to your 5S so that you have a virtuous system. And then, the last piece is just you're on the floor and you make it fun because that's
So,
something that people usually struggle with is making it fun.
so if you're listening to this pod and you have a warehouse operation that could be better, the first thing that you do is, like Will, take a trash can, walk around, pick the trash, sort it, and that's the right place to start.
I believe so. It does two things by doing that. One, you're going to start to see what the heck is on your floor and what actual problems are. Two, you're going to go see where a bunch of stuff is like stuck. Three, you're going to get to talk to all your team members because when you're picking up trash, anybody will talk to you at that point. You are no longer a unapproachable person at that point because you have chosen to say, "Hey, I will do whatever the worst job in this warehouse is. That's going to be my job." And that's what I always introduce myself as. I'm the head trash, I'm head of janitorial services because I truly believe that. Because
Wow.
I didn't ship an order. I never shipped one order in my entire. We probably ran operations and shipped, I don't know, 20 million packages in my life, and I've never shipped actually one order. So, but I have swept a lot of floors, I've picked up a lot of trash, and I've loaded a lot of boxes.
Wow, super actionable insight to start with. So you're setting up this, making the operations a little bit more organized there. Workstations are more organized. It sounds like these are much easier to do when you are not as busy. Or how do you scale that when you have temp workforces and so on?
Yeah, and so interesting story because when I got to Grunt Style, we'd just come out of a really, big growth year. We're going into another growth year, and now we're starting multiple operations. So we've got the e-com business that we have to figure out how to do, but now we're doing wholesale. We're doing fulfillment by Amazon. So we have to be able to, do multiple different operations at the same time. And that's where it goes to what I talked about sort, which is, removing all unnecessary equipment from the workspace. But then it goes into set and order. That's really critical because that's where everything has a home and a space and a place. And that ties directly to station readiness. Station readiness, as well as just standard work, right? When we set things in order, that is why I go back to like if you set your people's day in order and you set the key tasks that they have to do each hour, then it doesn't matter if they have 10 people or 50 people. The same thing goes with work instructions, right? That's part of setting things in order is that when I get to my pack station, I'm going to have instructions there in case I'm training or in case I forget how to do something. I don't want somebody to have to think.
Hmm.
I'd rather just have them to be able to read. And then guess what? It doesn't matter if I get a new person because as long as they can read at like a third or fourth grade level, which is where I usually try to build all my materials to with pictures, then they're going to easily be able to execute the processes that I've given them. And if they have any barriers, then that's why I have leaders that are going to be, in close proximity and helping them so that they can remove those barriers for them. And that does take time, right? So that's it's hard because you're trying to run your operation while you're doing that. That goes back to why leaders need to be present in doing that type of service because that to me is the value that leaders bring to the operation.
Nice. Can I be the idiot that needs to ask you what all the five S's are?
Yeah, sort, set in order, and then shine, and then you're going to have sustainability, and so and the ability to sustain is more about how do you encompass the whole process, right? Like so, it's much more than just like how do I keep it going from a cleanliness
Mm.
perspective. It's like where do I order the materials that are needed for
Mm-hmm.
supply? So then that gets into like a Kanban type process where you want to have a
Yeah,
cell
yeah.
course. And so it's obviously you want to standardize. So you standardize and then you sustain, and that's why it's so critical to get all of the 5S's. I usually start by trying to get to 2S.
Okay.
2S, because like you sort and you set in order, and then you start to shine, which is you just make it pretty.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
I'm usually doing myself with mops and brooms, and then you just inspire others, and then you don't have to, right? And then then you sign ownership. But guess what? When you do that every morning, when that's usually my first thing is I'm doing a walk because I'm picking up trash, but I'm also saying hi, giving fist bumps, handshakes. If you have people that speak different language, you try to greet them and their greeting of the day with their languages because you want to meet them where they're at, right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that's how you can have really high standards of cleanliness and discipline, but it's through a servant way of doing it. So it's not like a draconian, you will do this. It's now, hey guys, this is what's going to help us be most successful. And then the other piece of 5S is you make things visual. And so, and I'll use the airport as an example. If you land in O'Hare and you're at the international terminal, you are 6 to 7 miles away from baggage claim. But there's a sign that points you how to get to baggage claim. And every day, and I think all three of us have been in some form of transportation in the last, week or two, and somehow you made it, right? And some of you in different countries that you might not even speak the language, but that shows what visualization can do, and that's part of 5S,
Mm.
and so that helps drive that culture of discipline, but also of like, hey, I know what to do. I don't need my leader to tell me what to do. If I see something that's out of standard, I can put it back into standard because that's true. The true value of 5S is that the standard becomes known, out of standard becomes easily to identify, and you don't need a leader to tell you to do the right thing because it's now understood what should be done.
But who sets these standards? Is that something that you do, or is it your next tier of leaders? How do you train them if they end up doing this? What's your approach? What has worked for you?
In my opinion, people do what they see modeled. It's very similar to being a parent. You have what you tell your kids and you have what they see you do. And so if you want, for example, I expect development of all my leaders. So I set one-on-ones with all my leaders and I do it
Mm.
weekly and we do professional development. So then naturally they think, oh, that's, I guess, what we're supposed to do. And then, yes, you set up a program of leadership development that
Yep.
says, yes, you're going to meet with any of your subordinate leaders once a week. But because they're seeing it modeled to you, they don't have to recreate the wheel. So I'm just going to do what Will does. He asks me what I need, what I'm working on, and he gives me any feedback that I might need help on. And then that becomes a simple model. Very, very similarly with your leaders of like how you want them to talk to associates. Well, how do you talk to them? If you're constantly telling them, only giving them feedback on issues, then guess what? Then they're only going to talk to their associates about problems. But if you're constantly doing both, where you're giving them, hey, that was awesome, way to crush the backlog last night, great throughput, or whatever it is that you're finding something to give them credit for because they do a lot of hard work. Hey, I saw that you had this issue. Let's talk about your barriers. Well, then that model of communication becomes how they talk to your associates. And so to me, it's development starts with how you lead your direct reports. And for me, that was senior operations managers or directors. But then it's like you got to then help show them how to engage with associates, show them how to engage with their subordinate leaders. And so to me, I use a show, shadow, support method. So, first step is I'm going to show you how to do it. Then I'm going to shadow you as you do it. And then I'm going to, step back and let you run. And then I'm going to support you in what you need.
You made an interesting point at the start. You said you go in and it's not about the people, but I think like the obvious assumption there is that there is someone like yourself going in to provide the leadership in that bit, and that's probably it's one of the biggest gaps I see inside often like almost bedroom brands we call them in the UK, where like they started off shipping out of their bedroom or like their mum's garage or something. I think there's quite a few multi-millionaires that started that way. So it's probably a good indicator that you're going to go somewhere. So they start like that, and they might end up with a warehouse. But maybe if they're in their 20s, they've never had like a senior leadership person, or like even that
Right.
like that operational person that's just so strong in the people side of things, because you can get by in a lot of other functions like with quite small teams, and you don't have to index on that so much.
Yeah, leadership is it's weird. It's not often taught, for people growing up. I spent a lot of time in the military, probably went to 7 or 8 different leadership training schools, but it's really more about just understanding that people will do amazing things if they're allowed to. And so I think for me, it starts with like leadership for those young, you're talking about those young entrepreneurs, which are
Yeah,
the
yeah.
people that I have, the utmost respect for because they can take ideas from nothing, right? And then they can start putting it into action. And sometimes they just need like an integrator like myself who says, all right, here's how we can take your great ideas and make it work. And that goes back to just understanding like what your key strong points are and what opportunities you have and where you need to leverage other people to help support.
Yeah, they know how to create the chaos.
Yep, and I know how to tame it. And that's what you want, right? Like, hey, you create a little bit of chaos and we'll figure out how to tame it for you.
Yeah, yeah. So like still I still think it's so underrated as a skill set in e-commerce. I think it's become more so in the last couple of years, like the importance of operations. I think we had a period going back quite a little bit where the heydays of the Facebook where people could grow and you didn't have to think about your customer experience so much because you could just go and acquire another load of customers. It was easy to do that. Whereas as everything's been pressed there, it's become more and more about that like level of maturity and also like our expectations of
Are
what
insane.
yeah, it's Amazon just setting the bar on everything, right?
Right. Yeah, they've really changed the expectation of what customers want and desire, demand. And so, getting people to be able to provide that type of service, it requires integration, not just effort. You can't just solve for effort. And I think that's usually where most people struggle is that they don't understand some of these principles or tools, which makes sense,
Mm.
truly, just given at least, in America, we have a, ready, fire, aim type mentality when it comes to solving problems. And so, one of the key things is just stop, right? Like, hey, let me just do an assessment. And it's hard when you walk into a place like when I walked into where I was at Grunt Style, we had a ton of opportunity, right? Like I had inventory and accuracy to an extent that was just insane, but I had leaders that just didn't know how to use their system. I had leaders that didn't know how to talk to associates. So it's like, where do I start? Well, I go back to like, that's why I start with 5S. That's why I start with servant leadership, because if we get those two things right,
Mm.
we're going to have an organized workspace. We're going to have people who can talk to their leaders and leaders who can talk to their people. Then we can start problem solving. And then for
Yeah.
me, then that's how you can work together to leverage, each other to solve your problems.
Yeah, you can't dive in on the most complex stuff, is I guess your message there. You got to get some foundational bits in place.
Well, let's dive into some tactical things about what you change. I think you touched on some of them, like leadership and so on. But what changes when you scale from, say, 1,000 packages a day to 10 or 20 or 30,000 packages a day?
Flow is the first thing. Is you have to have flow standards. I call it flow planning. And so it's understanding your bottlenecks. And that to me is really the hardest thing because it doesn't matter like any of the places I've been to, that was usually what was the root cause of the problem was there was some form of a bottleneck, right? And in Grunt Style's case, it was bin transfers. I need to pick more. I need to pack more. Whatever it is. Well, it's like, guess what? Every time you're picking, that bottleneck of bin transfers is just now increasing. Okay, so we haven't really helped us. We just picked a bunch, and now we're going to not pick anything for the next 4 hours because there's a whole bunch of replenishments that need to take place. And so that understanding is, I guess, is hard for a lot of people. But if you break it down into simple math, which is usually how I try to do it, is you start of like, all right, what's my process? I'm gonna have pickers, I'm gonna have packers, and then I need to replenish. Well, at what rate are they doing all of these things? And these are just simple like planning estimates. And when I walked in, I'd ask, hey guys, what is our pick rate? And they would tell me what the goals were. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. That's what the goals are. But what are we actually picking at? Because you can't build flow off of goals. You build flow off of actuals. And then you make those actuals go faster together, and then that's how you'll get better throughput. And that's sometimes hard for people because they just want to really drive, like, no, I got to get them to pack harder and pack faster. That's usually when they make more mistakes. I'd rather just figure out how to make it easier for them, and then they'll naturally do it better, and then they'll naturally do it faster.
And talking about metrics, one of the interesting things that I saw you do was, um, hey, I have this digital dashboard that can go on a TV, but I don't want it. I want a simple whiteboard, and I want people to come and update these numbers? What was your thinking behind it?
So it's interesting. A lot of, and even today, everybody's about digitalization and automation. And we have more information at our fingertips than we could ever possibly make action off of. So it's really about teaching people how to engage with the data. And that to me is why I have a whiteboard. So it's like, yeah, you'll have a virtual dashboard that you're pulling all your information from. But it's more about that green or red pen that you go up to the board and you say, I'm in standard or out of standard, and here's what I'm doing about it, or here's what I did to get this to happen. And then that board that we had those key measurements on it that then everybody has to then figure out, how do I pull for that? How do I monitor that? But then I got to report out on it, and then I got to talk about what I'm doing about it. And that over time, and again, and that's where it's hard, right? Because they are when I first started doing this and I was doing pacing meetings, I mean, I kid you not, like I'm there. I essentially had to lead every pacing meeting on every shift for about 3 weeks, right? Which is fine. But you just have to start teaching them. And then you they start to understand, oh, if I'm not picking as fast as I thought I was, that's going to hurt my pack lines. And so I need some form of understanding. That's what I'm doing here. If I see that my bin transfers are getting out of, the standard protocol that we've given in terms of control limits, then that is going to cause a problem later. So I'm going to make adjustments before the problem happens. And that's really what it's about, is engaging them at data that they will eventually understand, right? But the cool thing about operators is they have a natural just knack of like, well, I kind of know how the things go, right? When you tie that to numbers, where they're the ones writing it down every 2 to 3 hours, now they can see when they look at the numbers, they go, oh, I know what's going to be happening on my floor. And vice versa, when they look at their floor, they're like, oh, I better go check my numbers because they're probably off, or I must be doing really well. And then that's where you have what I call operational synergy. And then people really start to execute well.
So if you're operating a warehouse, go get a big whiteboard, get a green pen, get a red pen,
Yeah.
and yeah, start
Yeah,
tracking some
set
of
some
these
upper
metrics.
control limits, put it out there, give it, and you want your lowest level of leadership to do it. When I was at DHL, when I ran several warehouses, but one of them we supported Campbell's Soup. We're shipping 400 trucks a day, and I had associate level, but they ran my entire warehouse. They called all the shots. If they needed an extra driver outside, they called it. If they needed somebody to move from this function to that, they did. And the supervisors then went and just supported the team and asked what they needed for help. Because that's the other piece, is that leaders try to lead the operation. No, your job is to lead the people. Let the people run the operation.
That's probably something that every business owner or senior leader struggles with. So it's like picking out the warehouse and the logistics side of the operations, but everything you're saying is completely applicable to every department within an e-commerce business. And actually, probably a lot of it does transfer incredibly well and should be transferred across the business a lot more.
Yeah, no, we did it at Grunt Style. We use the same principles in manufacturing as well as customer service. Customer service, we reduced our workforce from about 40 agents when I got there to about 15. And part of that is just because we didn't have all of the shipping issues that we were having, so we didn't need as many people answering, where's my package? Because nobody was wondering where their package was because it came in and went out.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal. But it's similar processes. We did the exact same thing where we did digital 5S instead of physical 5S. We set up how people's desktops were. We did spaghetti diagrams of what their mouse would do and where they would click. And we, created very specific, like, who's our best agents? This is how they set it up. Let's have everybody else use a similar standard. So again, it doesn't really matter what element of the business you do it to. We did the same thing with design in terms of creating visual management of where projects were at. And so, used, again, a whiteboard to show where projects were at and, if they were past due or how long they were taking. Again, just taking standards, making them visual, making it understood what is expected, and then giving people the tools to do what they need to do.
Yeah, you seem like someone who would be really good in a crisis. I've got a sense that you might. I got the sense you might know how to keep a cool. You might know how to keep a cool head. Have you got a great story that you can share with us around like a genuine oh, this is bad moment? There's like how you handled that situation, but also like if anyone's been in that situation, what were the actual what were the lessons that you took away from it as well?
So this one's, I think a lot of listeners who, at least if you run a warehouse, I think they're going to relate to me on this one, is it's when your dock dies. The dock, to me, is always the bottleneck that's most overlooked because it's the end of the tail. It's also where people try to run a higher throughput on the dock for some reason. I truly never got that. I never did. I just tried to staff it to whatever people needed to do because it's physical labor and intense labor, and you don't want people getting hurt. You also don't want people throwing your boxes around and getting damaged, and then customers don't even want them when they get them, right?
Yeah.
Like there's other like true costs of concessions that you need to consider that often warehouse leaders maybe not be connected to because they don't always see the concessions that come back or whatever like that. But so what we did is an escalation process of for yard drivers and like scheduling, like ensuring, and then we had more leadership involvement at the starts of shift to make sure that we had the right staffing, that we had a backup on call or something to that nature.
From a process perspective, everything's gone through the pack station, the shipping label's been printed. Often that's the trigger to go back to ERP, to go back to website, to go to Shopify, email saying, here's your parcel, here's your tracking link. So like most consumers, like we all know different. Like sometimes you get that notification. It doesn't mean it's left the building. So in that scenario as well, then everybody that's been scanned and come through, they all think they're going to get their parcel.
I think now if there's a supply chain issue, just because we've had so many, that have been public in the last 5 years, but at least it went out in 2019, 2018, that was still at the time where it's like, nope, we're going to get it in a day or two. If that's what we said, we got to do it. And so a lot of pressure to execute to that. And honestly, you want to, right? Because like you talked about at the beginning, at least from my perspective, that's how supply chain becomes a weapon for your company, for your selling. Is like, hey, when we were at when I was at Grunt Style, we went from the 2020 year where Sharoon was in the warehouse trying to help people ship orders because they were just so backlogged, to where we had an average of order to ship time of 12 hours in the next peak. And we shipped 24,000 packages a day as opposed to the, paltry 12,000 they were able to do.
It's full transformation. I find often getting founders to think about their max output in their warehouse equals the max revenue they can drive through their business. Why do we need to make the throughput bigger? Well, that means when you do a 5 million day, we can actually ship a 5 million day, but we don't do more orders than normal and then disappoint all the new customers or give our worst experience during that time. And then you deal with the backlash. The other one was like trying to make them think about stock on the shelf like money. Because I think that's the other thing that happens when people are touching products all day, their relationship to it just starts to change. And
agreed.
It's effectively dollar, but it's dollar, whatever your product's worth, it's dollar bills stacked up on a shelf. And so when you start,
which is why you don't want a ton of it, right? Always stacked up, which is hard because you don't ever want to not be able to go pull it, but at the same time, you don't want too much. So it's definitely a balance.
Let's leave our listeners with a bunch of tactical tips. We are in Q2. What should they think about today in Q2? What should they think about in Q3? How can they prepare now?
Yeah, for me, peak season planning should start in January, right? Because that's when you're doing your continuous improvement projects to try to really like take the lessons you just learned from peak and say, hey, what do I need to do better? And then, hopefully at that point you've going into Q3, you understand you've gone through your problem solving cycle. And so now you should be like, in my mind, I always made my people do a white paper on peak readiness, and we would document and outline. And really it's like a development opportunity for your leaders. But the things that I focus on to start with is bottlenecks is the first thing you'd go through. So you want to look at every single one of your bottlenecks. And what do I mean by bottlenecks? Bottlenecks could be your dock. If your dock is only a certain space big, then that's a bottleneck. So then we have to look at like either how often it gets cleared, when the delivery schedules are picked up. Like that's just things you have to start connecting. And those are things that your associates can't control, and which is why you as a leader have to look at it. The other thing is the throughput rate planning that we talked about, or flow planning. Understanding, like, do you have measurement against all of those? so that like if that's so important, because not just like the leader needs to understand like what is my flow rate or my pick rate, my pack rate, or even like it could also be your how fast it takes you to replan your boxes. Like these are all the types of rates that you need to have in some form of a model, so that you can then take, hey, if I get this many orders, what does it do to all these bottlenecks, right?
Yeah.
And then you start to look at, from that perspective, my resources. And the first place I look at resource would be like equipment, technology, and enhancement type things that I could use. Whether that be extra pickups, whether that be whatever the case is. Maybe it's a different poly bag that's easier to fit things in, so that I can pack it out easier, so I don't have to have much of a selection depending on your type of product, right? And then you want to look at your resources from people, which is why, again, you have to have those throughput, because that'll give you the total number of people you need. And then you want to start socializing that with your leadership team, and because it's additional resources and cost that are likely going to come into play. But there's a way you can reduce that, and it's by getting those throughput measurements better with continuous improvement. So you want to start thinking about that now. And then lastly, I think it's very often overlooked, is how do I make this fun? Because like the thing that I think is really hard for leaders to understand, and I don't know why, and maybe it's just because, I mean, I grew up really poor. I served in the military, and I missed, birthdays, kids' births. I missed Christmases, whatever it was. But that sucks. Okay? We just have to just acknowledge it. And so people working on Thanksgiving is not fun. People working the day after Thanksgiving when everybody else is shopping is not fun. People working, throughout the weekend that everybody is shopping is not fun. So it's, what am I going to do to make it fun? To me, it might be dancing on something, get some music going, and get, just showing the people to act a little bit, crazy and have some fun. We would do some form of fun calendar where, we'd have a dress up day almost every single day of peak. We do tons of giveaways. I'm really big on that, because you can have the best planning in the world, but if your people hate their jobs, it doesn't matter. Like they're not going to execute well.
A really common gap I see is that communication gap between the reality of what's coming in the supply chain, which like ultimately you're at the end of, but you're not in complete control of when things arrive. That's up
Right.
to the supply chain team. And then the launches and how those things happen and how that trickles down, and you're given that time to prepare. What do you think those marketing roles should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think the important piece is to have a integrated go-to-market strategy, where if you're going to push something, you're doing a new launch of a product or going into these selling periods, it's just making sure that you're forecasting well with your supply chain team. And that's something that like I took, and I always took as like my job for my people, because this goes back to like what can your associates not do? Your associates
Mm,
can't go and figure out what the forecast needs to be, because they don't
yeah.
know. So that's what I had to make sure, that like I have the processes in place with the marketing, with the sales team, of like, this is what we expect for sales. I'm going to translate that into what it looks like for orders. I'm going to translate that what it looks like into units, so that I know what my people need and what they need to be staffed to. And then the other piece is, and I'm very big on this. If you're on the front end, get on a pick, get on a picking station, or get on a pack station, or grab a broom, because that's the way you learn what your people are doing. And guess what? It doesn't matter what you sell if you can't ship it.
Well, you worked at Chewy, you worked at Amazon, it sells everything you can think of. And then there's fashion and apparel. Oliver and I work with a bunch of these fashion and apparel companies. What's so different about it that it makes operations different?
The good thing about it is that it's lightweight, so it's usually less expensive to ship. But then it's also not something that you can just have in a tiny bin either, right? Because then have sizes. Sizes is hard. You don't want to put your larges and your mediums next to each other. You just don't, right? Like you're gonna want to put skew,
Yeah, yeah.
you're like we talked about, Sharon, like slotting a lot. Like that was very important to accuracy, because I'm like, guys, why would I have two of, the medium and the large right next to each other? Because the only way you know that is if you actually, see exactly that. But you could easily make a mistake. So you try to, separate those by two or three, and make different color bins if you can. Like anything you can do to help the associates, because that is the main thing that I see about apparel. The massive amount of SKUs you have to deal with becomes
Yeah.
hard for the associates.
Yeah, small, medium, and large all look the same. And then there's also the counterintuitive thing of before you have a warehouse system and you're fully using barcoding and you're doing slotting properly, everybody is hardwired. You always put small, medium, and large together. Otherwise, you wouldn't find anything. So
Right.
they're going in one way all the way through, and it was sometimes it would take like a couple of calls for the penny to drop, and they're like, so we can put anything anywhere. You're like, yeah,
You're
we
right.
can do
That
that.
was
And they're like,
exactly what.
So
Yeah, that's exactly what Grunt Style, because they used to just stick them all in a row, and they're like, I've got this style over here, and I'm like, okay, guys, but now every single picker is gonna have. Now, if they're big bins, it's different, right? But when you're looking at tiny ones like this, you're like, guys, this is humans. Like they still have to, scan it, and like you don't want to make it hard for them.
We're just starting to get into some of the more nerdy bits that we've all experienced firsthand. It's been about 5 years since I've been deep in warehouse and preparing for peak, that kind of mindset. I think the biggest takeaway for anyone is who we've chosen to have on the show and the role that you're in, and the mindset and the approach that you have around servant leadership and what you've talked about with like the 5S and your approach. It's all very methodical. It's all about setting things up with the right foundation and not trying to do the fancy stuff before you've got those like brilliant basics in place that then mean you can go on and do everything else. I found it really interesting chatting to you. It's really, really nice to meet you and hear about some of the things you've been up to, and think whether you run a warehouse or whether you just run an e-commerce business or run a service business like myself or software like ST, all of that stuff around leadership is super valuable, and everybody could be doing a better job of it, no doubt. So yeah, it's great to hear more about it.
Every time I spend a day with Will, I walk away being a better leader. So, Will, thanks for being on this pod and sharing your insights with us.
ST thought he was in the warehouse helping you. Actually, like you were coaching him, and he's coming away from things like, hang on a minute, like you think he's writing notes on the systems. He's like, right, what's he just done there?
And
Go
Well,
away.
sure.
It's
like
nice.
my reading list for a while was all about things that Will would drop. I need to read that, and that ends up being my reading
Yeah,
list.
amazing. It's great influence.
It's interesting. Everybody wants to get better, but they want to take the elevator. And you don't get to the top of a mountain by looking at it. It's just one little tiny step. And so it's just like you got it, but you got to take the stairs. And so that's the hard part, right? And so it's not fast, and it's not people. Some reason people want like big quick fixes. That's not how people change. You want little small improvement over time. And guess what? If you get 2% better every day, you'll be 100% better in 50 days.